everyone, and thanks for joining us on Diplomatic Channel. I'm Teniola Shobowale, standing in for your regular host, Amarachi Ubani. The President of the United Nations General Assembly, Professor Tijani Mohamed Bande, recently embarked on a 4-day official visit to his home country, Nigeria. It is the first time Professor Mohamed Bande is visiting Nigeria since he took over the leadership baton of the UN General Assembly from his predecessor, Mara Espinosa Garces of Ecuador. As the sole candidate for the position, Mohamed Bande was elected president of the 74th UNGA at the 87th plenary meeting of the Assembly in the United States on June 4, 2019. He's the second Nigerian to hold the office in 3 decades after late retired Major General and diplomat Joseph Garba. During his stay in Abuja, our foreign affairs correspondent, Amarachi Ubani, had an exclusive interview with him where he talked about various issues ranging from his appointment into office to Nigeria's foreign policy and relationship with the UN. Take a listen.
President Mohamed Tijani Bande, thank you for speaking with us on Diplomatic Channel. It's a pleasure having you here. And quite a visit you're making to Nigeria. Your first since your appointment as UNGA president. How does that feel?
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. It is nice to be back home, in a way, as it were, to discharge. It feels good to know that I have 200 million people looking after to make sure that I do right by them and that I represent them very well on the stage that I've been offered.
You're the first Nigerian UNGA president we're having since 1989 when Major General Joseph Garba was appointed. And he served between 1989 and 1989 and 1990. Do you feel like you have big shoes to fill?
Well, the job is big enough, and it was great that Major General Garba served in that capacity. We take pride not only in his work as Foreign Minister of Nigeria at the period he served, but also his service at the United Nations during the period that Nigeria was a major player in the anti-apartheid struggle. But Joe Garba and I have been around in the sense that I served as DG NIPS after him as well. So it is good to know that a Nigerian had also served in that capacity, and I take inspiration from the leadership he provided at the time he served.
And it seems the spotlight is on Nigeria, with your position now. Do you feel that there's a lot of expectation from the country now that you're UNGA president?
Well, the expectation is natural. First of all, the truth of the matter is that for Africa to agree that another Nigerian 30 years on should be given the opportunity to serve in that capacity on behalf of the African continent, but dealing with really global challenges, I think is an honor to Nigeria. But I see it in the sense that during the period that we had the leadership of the General Assembly, Nigeria was a very major player, especially during the anti-apartheid struggle. This time again, in the way Nigeria has given leadership, especially related to anti-corruption, and the very idea of a joint effort to deal with terrorism, I think this also have given space to Nigeria dealing with illicit flows as a global issue with the support of the African Union and others, but certainly Nigeria has led in this matter being brought to the attention of the global community. So it therefore connects that when we do give leadership, that is also not lost around the world. And I think that it is the same element of a seriousness in government.
And speaking of leadership, some feel that, because of the kind of foreign policy that we have, our leadership is not felt strongly in the international community, the UN, for example. And I know President Buhari did make a case for Nigeria at the last UNGA when he recounted, some of the achievements of his government, and then he called on the international community to partner with Africa for economic development and so on. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the point President Buhari made fundamentally was the whole question that Africa connects to the world in the way it defines global issues, be it in the Middle East or about climate change, and the whole question of partnerships. Partnerships are key, not only for Nigeria but for the continent. But more and more, we are dealing with an Africa that is more cohesive in the way it addresses its concerns. Of course, we are dealing with, with a world post the Cold War, even if there are new challenges, but at least Africa is coming together to deal with its own issues. ECOWAS is stronger than it has been. The AU is also stronger in the way it coordinates its own work. And Nigerian leadership has been key in both of these organizations. And it is the same element around the world, that partnerships are key for the region, for Africa.
And these corporations have not been strong enough to move the hand of the UN towards those reforms that former Secretary General, forgotten his name now, sorry, he talked about. The UN is talking about reforms for a long time. Africa is a huge bloc within the United Nations, and yet we still don't have a place in the Security Council, a permanent place in the Security Council. Are you looking forward to these changes, these reforms being implemented during your time as president, or at least a proper start?
I think the UN has been reforming relating to the work of the General Assembly. There has been a lot of discussion concerning how to revitalize the work the General Assembly does. There have been reforms in the way the Secretariat also works, in terms of getting the UN to work as one, in terms of cost cutting, in terms of volume for money, in terms of efficiencies. Now, in relation to the Security Council reform, the reform started 2 decades ago. Initially, open-ended discussions. Now we have the intergovernmental negotiations are on, and they have been slow because it is an issue of power. It's always difficult to deal with transfer of power and how many members should be on the council to make it still effective, what we should do with the veto, if it should remain, how should it remain. These have been tough questions, and you note that almost all African heads of state and government, when they address the assembly, have made this an important matter. But it's not just an African issue. It's an issue around others who do not have the weight they think they should have in relation to the council, in terms of representation, in terms of democratization of the institution, while still making it effective. Now, they have been slow, but it's not that we have been completely without some progress. I'm appointing, as is the tradition, co-facilitators who will guide us in pushing forward the reform. We are not going to have, by the end of the 74th Assembly, a reformed and agreed council, but our effort is to see that we make sufficient progress such that we can say there is reasonable hope that in the not so distant future we can have a reformed council. It is a consensus issue in the sense that we have to get everyone on board, especially the members that currently are permanent, the 5. There is a requirement also for them to sign on individually to any such proposal for reform. And it is tough, but pressure is mounting because around the world everybody appreciates that representation is key. Post-1945, we are dealing with now 74 years. Certainly, it is due for reform. So reforms are ongoing, they are slow, but they must continue. And I will work really hard to see that we get to a point where we make substantive progress during the 74th Assembly.
So acknowledge, you're pointing out that there are other different blocs that are also looking forward to a permanent representation in the Security Council. But you would think that, with the United Nations, many of the UN agencies do have representation in Africa. And this is almost where most of the resources go towards. This is where, all the help, you're dealing with wars on the continent, you're dealing with, refugee crisis and so on. You would think that, Africa would get more attention from the UN.
Well, Africa is getting attention in the time Africa is discussed in the Security Council. But I think the real issue is for Africa to make it that that kind of attention is not the kind of attention it should receive, dealing with conflict. And so the more the AU and sub-regional organizations are able to assist countries to deal with conflict situations, the better for us. And the attention Africa is receiving, most of it is already something that is pledged. We have agreements that countries that are in particular situations should be helped as a matter of necessity for the organization, because world peace is for everyone.
And Africa contributes a lot to world peace.
Of course, Africa,
peacekeeping missions. A lot of us are there.
Africa has contributed to world peace as it should, and this is the issue. So Africa, therefore, deserves the attention, but it should get a different kind of attention, dealing more not with conflict mitigation, but with development. And that is what is important. We should get to a point where we are dealing not with peacekeeping, but really that we are dealing with development, and this is important.
Indeed it is. And I'm sure you've heard the criticism of Nigeria's foreign policy, even while in the United Nations. The criticism is that we don't have a clear foreign policy. Do you think we do have one?
I think there are two questions. When you look at a period, let's say 30 years ago, you deal with each era will require a different approach to the world. When you talk of the clarity of issues that are, excuse the fun, but the fun about it, black and white, relating to, say, apartheid, is a bit more different now. You are dealing with a different set of issues, whether you are dealing with nationalism, we are dealing with a pushback relation to migration. There are different issues than the issues we are related to in the past. When you are dealing with a world in which we had really very clear divides ideologically, those aligned to this bloc and those aligned to others, the foreign policy must be muscular in relation to those issues. Now, what we have are issues of pandemics. We're not dealing with left or right. You are dealing with climate. It's not left or right. And left or right must work together, because there is no question. You cannot deal with terrorism on the framework of left or right. So each situation would secrete or bring about what kind of policy can work. In addition, you also deal with what resources, what leverage do you have? If you had leverage, let's say in 1973 or 75, because of the centrality of oil to the global economy, you have less leverage relating to that as a resource. And so these elements come into play as to what you do.
So do you think our foreign policy now, as it is, that's Nigeria's foreign policy as it is, do you think it reflects the changing world that we live in?
There have been conferences that I know of to review the foreign policy of Nigeria. This review, I think, is needed, even if it's 10-yearly cycles. and this should be done very soberly, assessing methods and resources, as well as the situation globally. It's not just a Nigerian issue. It is what each country must do. So Nigeria, as Nigeria, of course, is advised, like all others, to review how it attains its objective through its use of diplomacy. Just as Africa must also do that at the level of the continent in relation to the world. So there have been reviews. Maybe they have not been as thoroughgoing, but I think it's not the case that we have changed the whole notion of our focus, because no one has stated that Africa is not the centerpiece, for example, of the foreign policy of Nigeria. There has been no review that this is not the case. What we need to do is to do a review to see what exactly it is we are doing. Are we effective in the way we are doing it? Again, this is something that all governments must do, not only in relation to foreign policy, but in relation to all policies.
As current president of the UNGA and being a Nigerian yourself and a diplomat, seasoned one at that, would you be using your position to portray Nigeria's foreign policy, and would you also be reflecting Nigeria in a particular light in the UN?
I think let's be clear. Every person who has been president of the General Assembly had come from a country. Nobody who was stateless served as president of the General Assembly. So the person brings sensitivities of his or her location, but the role is a clear one. You are to play the mediator. There are 193 countries that are member states of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And what you do is try to see that in respect of any issue, you are even-handed and you get the very best in terms of discussion. And there are rules to allow for that discussion to happen. Now, in relation to the duality of roles, as you look at them, I think matters are made far easier for two reasons. One, the expectation is that I am representing a continent. I mean, it's not that I'm doing work only for the continent, but that the issues we have agreed to as priorities of the presidency are issues that are urgent issues for the continent of Africa, but they are also important issues for other parts of the world. They emanate from the Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed to by the United Nations as a whole in 2015. And what we are doing in the presidency is to focus on implementing or galvanizing support for the implementation of some goals which we consider strategic, namely quality education, zero hunger and poverty eradication, and inclusion, including climate action. So these ones are important. And the role is really of an umpire that pushes and also supports implementation of agreed to goals in terms of negotiations, in terms of implementation as well. Yes.
That's a very diplomatic answer. Thank you again, President Muhammad Tijani Bande, for speaking with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we wish you well in your presidency.
Thank you very much for the prayers, and thank you for the support.
And this is where we end the program today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, you can catch up on all our other episodes on youtube.com/channelsweb. I'm Teniola Shoboale. Bye for now.